So I mentioned these two filaments yesterday. We kind of talked about those during the lecture, but this is kind of a little bit more information about them. So there's the two filaments, the thick and thin. All right. So your thick filament is the myosin filament. The thin filament is the actin filament. All right. When we see those in the diagrams, and they're mainly given those names because they're composed of those specific proteins. All right. So myosin is composed of the protein myosin, and actin is composed of the protein actin, and that's just essentially why they're given those names. One of the things that is a little bit different about actin and myosin has an enzyme attached to it as well. I don't think it'll show up as a test question or anything, but it's called ATPase. All right, so we know that ATP is the energy for most all cellular kind of activity. That ATPase allows myosin to break down ATP and then use it for energy. All right, so when we talk about the actual muscle contraction here in just a minute, and the neuromuscular junction, we'll talk about why ATP is kind of important. Morning. She is probably up in the science office. 220. She wasn't there. She might be in it. It's Friday, so she might be in a meeting as well. Okay, sorry. All right, but those are your two basic filaments. All right, if I scroll down here, you can kind of see a little bit of them. Again, your thicker one here that's red, all right, is your myosin. All right, and then this thinner one that we see here on the outside that's kind of stacked, then are your actin filaments, okay? All right. All right, a couple other things with the microscopic anatomy. So the important thing on myosin is that myosin actually has these little kind of heads, or what we call cross bridges, is what they're mostly normally referred to as. So the way that this whole process works is that myosin will actually reach out and attach itself to actin and then pull. All right, sort of like if you were to row a boat in water. All right, so it reaches out and then it pulls, and when it does that pulling, it's sliding those actin filaments closer together to each other. The myosin actually doesn't move except for those cross bridges kind of reaching out. All right. There is a bare zone in there. I don't think you really need to kind of remember that, but just remember that this is the point at which we're going to slide those filaments together. Okay. The other thing I think that's kind of important here is that the sarcoplasmic reticulum, that SR, that kind of transport system, stores calcium. Calcium is necessary for this process to actually kind of get started. Calcium sort of works like a mechanism to kind of switch on this process. All right, so I'm gonna we'll talk about this and then I'll switch gears. So skeletal muscle tissue has two basic properties here. Okay, one of irritability, so that's simply being able to receive and respond to some sort of a stimulus. All right, so the stimulus is going to be coming from the central nervous system. All right, and then the ability to respond to that would be its ability to contract. So that's its second property, which is contractibility, which is simply just the ability to shorten when it's received enough of that stimulus. Yeah, that's okay. All right. So the way that this process takes place is that skeletal muscles are kind of paired up with neurons. All right. So the actual contraction or the actual kind of working part of a muscle are these things called motor units. All right. It's going to be a neuron and then the muscle fibers that it actually stimulates. Okay. So you can see in the diagram over here, we've got two motor units and I'll circle them. We got the first one here, which is I'll do in dark blue. The second one I'll do kind of in a light blue. So the first motor unit actually only is innervating those two fibers right there that I just highlighted kind of in dark blue. All right, the second motor unit actually has three fibers. All right, and this is why skeletal muscle tissue is so versatile, meaning that I can pick up 5 pounds and 50 pounds with the same muscle, but use different force. All right, so all that really changes here with the amount of force that we're using is recruiting more motor units. All right, so that's why if you were to try to pick up 50 pounds and then turn around and pick up 5 pounds, you don't use the same force. All right, because your body is able to recruit certain motor units and be able to do that. Right, and that's what's kind of neat about muscle tissue is that it will recruit those. That's also one of the reasons sometimes when people become injured, it makes it really hard for them to contract muscle tissue, is because they lose that ability to recruit those motor units for a short period of time. Especially after surgeries, a lot of times they'll lose the junction between those motor units. So they have to relearn that. And that's why like physical therapy is important. Okay, right there. All right. So the process is very similar to what we talked about in the nervous system. So we've got this thing called the neuromuscular junction. Essentially, it just essentially is the site of where the nerve and the muscle kind of innervate. All right. So that's this junction we see right here in the diagram. The nerve doesn't actually make contact with the muscle tissue. All right. It's just kind of in that little bit of a docking station, or you could kind of sort of call it. So because of that, we're going to have a transmitter or a neurotransmitter involved here. All right. So same idea in the nervous system again. We've got a synaptic cleft. All right. So that's the gap between the nerve and muscle. All right. That area is filled with interstitial fluid, which allows then chemicals to be transferred back and forth between the two. All right. Brooke, you good? Holler at me if I'm going too fast. Okay. All right. So the big thing here is that we've got this neurotransmitter. All right. So we know that neurotransmitter is just simply that chemical that creates the nerve impulse. The big one here for skeletal muscle tissue is this neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. All right. My guess is, and we haven't finished the assessment yet, but that probably will be a test question. Most likely just a multiple choice. They might ask, what's the neurotransmitter that's released? All right. That neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. What that neurotransmitter does is it allows the sarcolemma, that plasma membrane that's around the outside of the muscle cells, to then become permeable to sodium. All right. Sodium is necessary because if we allow sodium to rush into the cell, we create that action potential that we talked about in the nervous system. All right. And this is most likely where most people come up with the idea that if people are cramping, they need to add salt to their diet. All right. Is because sodium is associated with this. The problem with that is that our diets anyway probably contain enough sodium that we do not need to do that anymore. It wasn't unheard of about probably 20 or 30 years ago to actually have athletes take salt tablets, right? They thought that that would help stave off cramps, right? And that's probably about the same time Gatorade was developed, was back then. It was developed kind of, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s. Um, and it was really salty at first. And again, it's because of this idea that salt's involved in this process. But I'll talk about why. It's not actually what's causing it, right? We've got plenty of salt available. It's not the fact that we don't have enough salt. It's not actually water. Huh? Well, it will help because, well, water is part of interstitial fluid. All right. Water is needed to kind of move some of these ions and things around on it, specifically in our blood. All right. But I'll show you here in a second when we talk about the whole thing. All right. All right. So a couple of things here. So we cause those sodium ions to kind of rush in, generates that basic action potential that we were kind of talking about there. And then the other thing we need to kind of remember is that once that action potential is started, we can't stop it. All right. So once we've innervated that muscle and caused it to start to contract, it's going to contract. There isn't anything we can do to stop that process, which is one of the reasons why getting cramps to stop are one of the hardest things to do. Because once that's started, that process probably is not going to stop for a period of time. There are ways to get it to stop, but they are not comfortable. All right, so I'm going to switch gears here just a little bit. I'm going to pull up a couple things. So there are two things up here for you guys to take a look at. I don't think you really need to write a whole lot down on these because I think they're there and they're available for you. So this is just a diagram of that whole kind of neuromuscular junction that's kind of activating the muscle tissue together. I think this is good. My brain just doesn't work like this. So I put it there in case you're one of those visual people that needs that diagram to be able to kind of show you. This is more how I like to look at it. So I just like to look at it in steps. Okay. So if we scroll back up to the top here of these steps, if it'll let me, it's kind of being a pain in the butt today. All right. So if we look at this, we notice that it just kind of works in order. So the first step was we have to have some sort of a nerve impulse, obviously. All right. The nerve impulse causes the release of acetylcholine. All right. Acetylcholine allows sodium and potassium ions to now switch places. All right. And that creates our action potential. Same thing like it was in the nervous system. We're just switching ions places. And if we move enough of one direction or another, that creates an electrical impulse. Okay. And that's the same idea here. So sodium and ion and potassium will switch places. This is also where a lot of people kind of think that eating bananas and things with lots of potassium in them will help with this process. The problem is not getting the muscle to contract. The problem is getting the muscle to relax. All right. So if we keep reading here, so number 4 talks about now we've got our action potential taking place. Once the action potential has taken place, the cytoplasmic reticulum now will release its calcium ions. Calcium ions are needed to kind of allow myosin to actually bind to actin. All right. So this is another thing that sometimes we take a look at, especially people who are prone to cramping. All right. They might not have enough calcium on board. All right. Again, the calcium isn't necessarily needed, but it's needed to change the shape here to cause the contraction to happen. So again, I always challenge with people that it's not so much sodium, potassium. So you can eat all the salt you want in the world and all the bananas you want in the world. And you can even drink all the calcium you want. It's still not going to keep you from cramping. All right, here's what happens. So if we move down, step 8 is what's going on. Okay. So step 8 talks about ATP. ATP is necessary to allow myosin to unattach or relax so that it's not grabbing a hold of actin and then re-grab a hold of actin. All right. If we don't have enough ATP available, myosin is just going to reach out and grab actin and hold on. And that's it. All right. It's the same thing when people die. They go into a process called rigor mortis, right? So rigor mortis is simply just muscle tissue now contracting, all right? And then they're kind of stuck in that process. Well, the reason why it doesn't relax is because their body's no longer pumping around and moving ATP and bringing it to the cells. So once the muscle cells have burnt through all their ATP, their natural state is to contract, okay? So once an athlete or anybody starts to get a cramp, all right, the only way to get rid of it is to start bringing on board more sugar, all right? They have to have sugar available to make ATP, which is why your Gatorades, your Powerades, and all those things are high in sugar, all right? They're necessary for that process to take place. The problem with that, though, is that it's going to take probably 7 or 8 to 10, maybe even 30 minutes to digest and pull in that sugar and convert it to ATP, all right? So a lot of times when I'm standing on the sidelines with a football player or wrestler or anybody who's got a cramp, coaches are always looking at us like, why can't you get that to stop? Well, sure, the kid eats sugar, it's going to still take that long for it to take place. Water, Michaela, I think you brought up earlier, is necessary, but as you can see, water doesn't play a role in this process. Water is just there as the medium to move these things around. All right. So dehydration, yes, can cause that because it can cause a concentration of these other ions to be available. But the main thing is if we don't have enough water, we can't move ATP as well. All right. It doesn't transport in our blood. It doesn't be held in those muscle tissues as well. All right. And then we aren't able to use it. So I always challenge athletes to start looking at their diet the day before a game that they cramped in. All right. And most of the time they didn't eat enough. They didn't eat enough the day before and they didn't eat enough the day of the game. So they don't have enough available ATP stored to be able to use it. All right. And that's usually what we see. Okay. And then the rest of this is just kind of talking about how the process kind of goes back the other direction. We now have to move sodium and potassium back, and then calcium has to be reabsorbed. Okay. So again, that's kind of why I always talk to athletes about their diet. And they look at me funny, like, what do you mean why do I have to worry about my diet? I'm cramping. All right. Well, it's because you didn't eat anything. Okay. Like our first football game this year, we had about 5 or 6 kids cramp, and each one of them didn't eat anything that Friday. I don't know how they do that. Like, how do you forget to eat? But it happens, I guess. All right. The last thing I really want to quickly talk about is this thing called the sliding filament theory. And I'm going to make this really simple. I don't think you need to write a whole lot of this down. All that's really going on here is this space between the actin fibers is simply being made smaller. All right. So actin reaches out, or myosin reaching out and attaches itself to actin and simply just pulls it together. All right. That's the whole idea here behind this sliding filament theory, is that myosin is going to cause actin to slide together. Okay. All right. So really kind of try to, so those myosin cross bridges will bind to those sites on the thin filament. All right. And then it releases, grabs another spot, pulls it, and then it pulls until it kind of slides it together. All right. I don't think we're going to stop there. Yeah. That's it. This next one just talks about the rest of that process, but that's really all that happens there. All right. That kind of simplifies a kind of complicated process for you.